Hi, and welcome back to Reddit Whispers. My life is a geography of absence. I am a cartographer of the lonely places, the vast, empty stretches of American highway that other people only ever see on a map. My name is Reese, and my Peterbilt is not just a truck, it is a hermetically sealed world, a mobile monastery where I am the solitary monk. The road is my religion. It has its rituals, the pre-dawn coffee, the methodical pre-trip inspection, the hypnotic drone of the Cummins engine that becomes a form of meditation. It has its sacred texts, the logbook, the bill of lading, the dog-eared Rand McNally atlas on the passenger seat. And it has its one unwavering article of faith, that this lonely, grinding, relentless life of sacrifice is a holy act, an offering I lay at the altar of my family. My wife, Bronwyn, is the high priestess of this faith. She is the keeper of the temple, our small, quiet home in the green hills of Ohio. She is the reason for the 10,000-mile pilgrimages. Her voice on the phone, a warm, steady signal cutting through the static of 1,000 miles, is the prayer that sustains me. She is the one who translates my brutal, physical labor into a life for our children. She transforms my diesel-fueled exhaustion into a mortgage payment, my sleepless nights into orthodontist bills, my crushing loneliness into a stable, loving home. I am the engine, she is the heart. That is the story I have told myself for 15 years. It is a good story. It is a noble story. And until a Tuesday afternoon in the dead, flat heart of Nebraska, I believed every word of it. The stop was not a choice. It was a mandate. My electronic logbook, a pitiless digital tyrant, had declared my 14-hour driving limit was up. I was legally required to stop for a 10-hour break. I was in Kearney, Nebraska, a place that is not a destination but a pause, a punctuation mark in the long, rambling sentence of Interstate 80. I pulled my rig into a sprawling, gravel-crusted truck stop that smelled of diesel, stale coffee, and the quiet desperation of men a long way from home. The Oasis, it was called, a piece of branding so cruelly ironic it was almost poetry. There is no oasis in a place like this. There is only a temporary cessation of movement. I was tired. A deep, bone-weary exhaustion that felt less like a physical state and more like a feature of my own geology. I decided to treat myself, to abandon the lukewarm coffee in my thermos and the sad prepackaged sandwich in my cooler. I was going to sit in a booth on a cracked vinyl seat that was not my own and let someone else pour my coffee. The cafe was a classic of the genre. The air was thick with the smell of frying bacon and regret. A handful of other drivers were scattered among the booths, each man an island, staring into the middle distance or at the screen of his phone. I took a booth by the window, a position that gave me a view of the endless, hypnotic procession of trucks on the highway. I ordered the special, a meatloaf of questionable origin with a side of mashed potatoes that tasted of nostalgia and industrial-grade butter substitute. I was halfway through this sad sacramental meal when the bell above the door jingled. I didn't look up at first. It was just another traveler, another temporary ghost seeking refuge from the road. But then I heard a laugh. It was a woman's laugh, a rich, warm, and utterly, devastatingly familiar sound. My head snapped up, and there, standing by the cash register, was my wife, Bronwyn, my Bronwyn. In Kearney, Nebraska, 1,000 miles from our home in Ohio, 1,000 miles from where she was supposed to be. My brain did not process the information. It simply short-circuited. The connection between my eyes and my understanding was severed. This was a hallucination, a mirage, a phantom conjured by exhaustion and loneliness. It was a waking dream, a cruel trick of the road. But the phantom was not alone. Standing next to her was a man. He was a trucker. That much was clear from his faded jeans, his worn leather vest, and the easy, road-weary way he held himself. He was laughing with her, his hand resting on the small of her back with a casual, unconscious intimacy that spoke of a deep and long-standing familiarity. My wife, The woman who had sounded tired and a little sad on the phone just last night, the woman who was supposedly at home dealing with a leaky dishwasher and helping our son with his history report, was a different person. The woman standing by that cash register was vibrant, energized, her face animated with a kind of joyful, unburdened laughter I hadn't seen in years. She was not the keeper of the temple. She was a fellow traveler. She was one of us. They took a booth on the other side of the cafe, their backs to me. I was invisible to them, just another faceless, worn-out trucker in a sea of them. But they were in sharp, brilliant, horrifying focus to me. The world outside the greasy window of that cafe ceased to exist. The rumble of the trucks on the highway faded into silence. My entire universe had contracted to the space of this small, fluorescent-lit room. I was no longer a participant in my own life. I was a spectator, a ghost at the window, watching a play in which I had just discovered I was not the hero, but a minor, off-stage character whose primary function was to pay for the production. I watched them. I couldn't not watch them. I watched as the waitress brought them coffee. I watched as the man, whose name I didn't know, reached across the table and took her hand. I watched as she intertwined her fingers with his. It was not the gesture of a new, illicit affair. It was the gesture of a couple, the easy, comfortable, unspoken intimacy of two people who had shared 1,000 cups of coffee in 1,000 diners just like this one. They were a road couple. It was a term I knew well, a phenomenon as old as the highway system itself. A driver who has a family at home and another secret family on the road. A partner who understands the loneliness, the strange rhythms, the unwritten rules of this life. I had heard stories. I had seen the couples at the truck stops, sharing a meal, a quiet conversation before climbing into the same cab for their 10-hour break. I had always looked at them with a mixture of pity and a kind of smug superiority. My love was different. My marriage was real. It was built on the solid bedrock of my sacrifice and her patient, unwavering faith. The foundation of my world was not bedrock. It was a sinkhole. And I was just now feeling the ground give way beneath my feet. I sat there, my fork frozen halfway to my mouth, my meatloaf a cold, greasy lump on my plate. The waitress came by to refill my coffee. "Everything okay, hon?" she asked, her voice a kind, gravelly sound. I just nodded, unable to speak. I was not okay. I was a man whose entire geography had just been revealed as a fiction. The map I had been following for 15 years, the one that showed my lonely road always leading back to her, was a lie. Her road, I now realized, ran parallel to mine. And she had her own co-pilot, her own partner for the long haul. My sacrifice had not been the anchor that kept her safe at home. It had been the very thing that gave her the freedom to roam. My absence was not a burden she had to endure. It was the space in which she lived her real life. I don't know how long I sat there. Time had become a thick, viscous fluid. Eventually, I saw them stand up to leave. He threw a few bills on the table. They walked to the door, his arm now draped casually over her shoulder. They were a team. They were a partnership. They were everything I thought we were. As they were paying at the register, I did something. The machine in my head, the cold, pragmatic trucker who knows how to handle a crisis, took over. I flagged down my waitress. I gave her my credit card. "I'd like to pay my bill," I said, my voice a strange, rusty croak. "And theirs, too, the couple who just left." The waitress looked at me, then at them, a flicker of understanding in her tired eyes. She had seen this story before, in 100 different variations. She just nodded, took my card, and went to the register. I watched as she told them their bill had been taken care of. I saw the look of confusion on their faces. They looked around the cafe, searching for their anonymous benefactor. Their eyes scanned right past me, a weary, insignificant man in a corner booth. They saw nothing. They shrugged, they laughed, he put his arm back around her, and they walked out, into the gathering dusk, towards the truck they apparently shared. The waitress brought my card back with the slip. I signed it. I added a large tip. I had just paid for my wife's dinner with her lover. It was not an act of anger. It was not an act of revenge. I did not yet know what it was. It was just an act. A single, quiet, and utterly devastating move in a game I had just discovered I was playing. I stood up and walked out of the cafe. The cool night air of the plains felt sharp and clean in my lungs. I walked back to my rig, my home, my prison. I climbed into the cab. I did not start the engine. I just sat there, in the darkness, surrounded by the sleeping steel beasts of my fellow travelers. I looked at the photograph taped to my dashboard, the smiling face of my wife, the woman from a different life. I reached out, my hand trembling, and I gently, carefully peeled it off. It left a small, sticky rectangle of residue on the plastic, a ghost of a ghost. And then I started the engine, and I pulled out of the oasis, and I drove, heading east, into a night that was darker and longer than any I had ever known before. The highway at night is a river of light, a relentless hypnotic flow of red and white that stretches to the horizon. It has always been my sanctuary, a place where the sheer mechanical act of driving could silence the noise in my head. But on that night, the road was not a comfort. It was a torture chamber. Every mile marker was a tick of a clock, measuring the time since my world had ended. Every pair of taillights in front of me was them, a phantom truck carrying my wife and her lover further and further into their secret life. My mind, which I had trained for years to focus on the road, on the weather, on the subtle shifts in the truck's performance, was now a runaway train. It was replaying the scene in the cafe over and over, each time with a new, more excruciating detail. The way his hand had rested on her back. The specific musical quality of her laughter, a quality I hadn't heard in years. The look of easy, comfortable intimacy between them. A look that spoke of shared histories, of inside jokes, of a life lived in the spaces between my phone calls. I was not just a husband who had been cheated on. I was a man who had been made redundant. The story of my life, the narrative of the noble, sacrificing provider, had just been revealed as a work of complete and apparently collaborative fiction. I had been the producer, the financer of a play, and I had just discovered that the lead actors had been rewriting the script for years, and my character had been reduced to a footnote in the program, mentioned only as financial contributor. The first phone call was the hardest. It was a test of my new, terrible resolve. My routine was to call her every night around 9 p.m., just before I settled in for my main sleep break. To not call would be a deviation from the pattern, a signal that something was wrong. And my only defense, my only strategy in this new, terrifying game was to maintain the illusion that nothing had changed. I had to continue being the ghost they believed me to be. I pulled over at a rest stop in Iowa, the air buzzing with the sound of a million cicadas. My hand was shaking as I dialed her number. She answered on the third ring. "Reese, hi, honey," she said, her voice a perfect imitation of the wife who had been at home all day waiting for my call. The performance was breathtaking in its audacity. "How's the road?" "Long," I said, my own voice a stranger's, a flat, dead thing. "Just a lot of corn." "Well, you sound tired," she said, her tone dripping with a wifely concern that was now a form of psychological violence. "You should get some rest. We're all fine here. Liam finished his history report. Chloe scored a goal at her soccer game." She was building the world for me, the world of our home, the world I was supposed to be picturing. She was painting a beautiful, detailed mural over the gaping black hole of her lie. And in the background of her call, I could hear it, a low, familiar rumble. It was not the sound of our house. It was not the sound of the television or the dishwasher. It was the sound of a diesel engine idling. She was in his truck. She was in his cab, probably just a few hundred miles ahead of me on this very same highway, telling me about a soccer goal that had been scored 1,000 miles away. The sheer bald-faced audacity of it almost made me choke. "That's great," I managed to say. "Tell them I'm proud of them." "I will," she said. "I love you, Reese. Drive safe." "You too," I said, and I hung up. I sat in my silent cab, the phone in my hand, and I felt a sense of profound, dislocating vertigo. I was a man untethered from reality. I was actively participating in the gaslighting of my own life. I had become a co-author of the lie. The rest of the drive home was a journey through a personal hell. Every mile was a new memory, re-examined and found to be fraudulent. I remembered the girls' weekends she would take, trips she claimed were for her to recharge and reconnect with old friends. I now pictured her at truck stops, in cheap motels, in the passenger seat of another man's rig. I remembered the unexplained credit card charges, small but consistent, from towns and states she had no reason to be in. Charges she had explained away as online purchases with strange billing locations. I remembered the times she had been unreachable for hours, claiming she had been in a movie with bad reception, when she had likely been in a stretch of highway with no cell towers. The archive of her deceit was vast, and I had been its blind, trusting curator for years. My pain was so profound, so all-encompassing, that it transformed into something else. It became a cold, quiet, and deeply focused curiosity. I was no longer the wounded husband. I was the investigator. I was the engineer, the man who needed to understand the full schematics of the machine that had just run him over. I needed a map of her secret life. When I finally got home to Ohio 2 days later, the house was a crime scene, and I was the sole detective. Bronwyn was the picture of the loving, waiting wife. She hugged me. She asked about my trip. She had cooked my favorite meal. Every gesture of affection was a new lie, a fresh layer of paint on a rotten wall. I played my part. I was the tired, road-weary husband, happy to be home. The performance was exhausting, but necessary. My investigation had to be covert. That night, after she was asleep, I began my work. I started with her car. She had her own, a small, practical SUV she used for errands and taking the kids to school. I had a spare key. I went to the garage in the dead of night, armed with a flashlight. I was looking for anything, any clue, any anomaly. I found it tucked into the side pocket of the driver's side door. A small, worn, spiral-bound notebook. It was a logbook. Not an official DOT-mandated logbook like mine, but a personal one. It was filled with her neat, careful handwriting. It was a record of dates, of cities, of mile markers. It was a shadow version of my own professional life. And next to many of the entries was a name, Jedediah. So the other ghost, the man in the cafe, had a name. The logbook was a chronicle of their life together. It went back 3 years. 3 years of shared journeys, of coordinated routes. It was all there. A trip to a music festival in Tennessee that had corresponded with one of her yoga retreats. A week in the Florida Keys that had happened while I was stuck in a blizzard in North Dakota. She wasn't just his lover, she was his co-pilot. She was living the very life I was, but as an adventure, not as a sacrifice. The most painful entry was the last one. It was from 2 days ago. Kearney, N.E., the Oasis. Dinner was strange. Some quiet old guy paid our bill. Jed thought it was funny. I don't know. I had a bad feeling all night. A bad feeling. I closed the notebook, my hands trembling with a cold, quiet fury. She had sat there, in that cafe, and she had felt not guilt, not shame, but a bad feeling, as if I were a strange, unsettling piece of bad weather. The final piece of the puzzle I found on her home computer. It was buried deep in a folder of recipes. It was a series of spreadsheets. My wife, the woman who claimed to be a creative, free spirit who hated math, had been keeping meticulous financial records. The spreadsheets detailed a second income, an undeclared, cash-only income. It was from freight forwarding, from her acting as an unofficial co-driver and dispatcher for Jed. They were a team. They were running a small, off-the-books trucking business, funded by the freedom that my own legitimate trucking business provided. They were not just lovers, they were partners. They had built a life, a career, a future in the shadow of my own. I sat in the dark, in the silent house, surrounded by the irrefutable, documentary evidence of my own erasure. The question was no longer if she was betraying me. The question was what to do with the truth. I had the power to destroy her. I could confront her, show her the logbook, the spreadsheets. I could file for divorce, use the evidence to take the house, the kids. I could burn her world to the ground. But as I sat there, the image of my children's faces came back to me. Their happy, untroubled, innocent faces. Their world was built on the foundation of this lie. My rage, my need for justice would be the earthquake that shattered that foundation. Was my pain more important than their stability? Was my truth worth the price of their peace? The decision I had to make was not about her. It was about them. I was still their father. I was still their provider. And my final, most terrible job, it seemed, was to become the silent, knowing guardian of the lie that was protecting them. I would not confront her. I would not leave her. I would do something far more difficult. I would stay. I would get back in my truck, and I would continue to be the ghost, the provider, the silent, invisible engine of their lives. But something had changed. I was no longer the blind, trusting fool. I was the warden, and I was about to go back on the road, not with the comfortable weight of a noble sacrifice in my heart, but with the cold, hard, and impossibly heavy knowledge that my wife's heart was on that same road, just in a different truck, heading in a different direction. The decision to return to the road, to knowingly and willingly step back into the fiction of my own life, was the hardest turn of the wheel I have ever made. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to stay, to confront, to detonate the truth and let the pieces fall where they may. But the image of my children's lives, their stable, happy world, was a weight on the other side of the scale, and it was a weight my own heart could not overcome. So I went back. I climbed back into the cab of my Peterbilt, and it felt different. It was no longer my sanctuary of solitude. It was my cell. The photograph of my family, which I had not put back on the dashboard, was now a blank, sticky rectangle that seemed to mock me with its emptiness. The road itself had changed. The long, hypnotic stretches of highway were no longer a meditative escape. They were a hunting ground. I was now acutely, painfully aware that on this same vast concrete grid, my wife and her lover were moving, living, breathing. Every other truck that passed me was a potential suspect. Was that him? Was she in there, in the passenger seat, laughing at a joke I couldn't hear? The paranoia was a constant low-grade fever. My gift, my only connection to the life I was supposed to be living, had been the phone. Now the phone was an instrument of torture. Our nightly calls became a new, more complex and more painful kind of performance. I was no longer just a tired husband. I was the counterintelligence agent, listening for the tales, for the slips, for the background noises that would confirm the truth I already knew. And she, in turn, was a master of her craft. Her stories were more detailed now, more vivid. She was overcompensating, painting a rich, textured picture of her quiet domestic life in Ohio to cover the vast, empty canvas of her reality. She would describe the meal she had just cooked, and I could almost smell the garlic and herbs, even as I knew she was likely eating a greasy burger in a diner in Arkansas. She would tell me about a funny conversation she had with our neighbor, and I would have to fight the urge to ask her to describe the weather where she really was. It was a grotesque, intimate dance of deceit.
We were two liars on opposite ends of a phone line, both pretending to be people we were not, both protecting a secret that was slowly, inexorably poisoning everything. I began to use my knowledge not as a weapon, but as a shield. Her logbook, which I had photographed with my phone before putting it back in her car, became my secret map. I knew their routes, I knew their schedules, I knew which truck stops they favored, and I began to orchestrate my own life around this knowledge. I would deliberately take routes that would lead me away from them. If their logbook said they were heading west, I would take a job going east. I was a ghost, and I was actively trying to avoid haunting my own life. This created a new kind of loneliness. I was not just alone on the road. I was in a self-imposed exile, a refugee from my own story. My world, which had already been small, contracted even further. My only companions were the hum of my engine and the heavy, suffocating weight of the truth I was carrying. The financial arrangement became a source of quiet, bitter irony. I was still the primary provider. My paychecks, the fruits of my lonely, grueling labor, were still deposited into our joint account. And I would still watch on my online banking app as the money flowed out, funding a life that was not mine. I watched as she paid for a new, expensive set of tires for her SUV, the vehicle she used for her secret trips. I watched as she paid for 2 plane tickets to Las Vegas for a girls' weekend, a trip I knew from the logbook had been with him. I was not just being betrayed, I was paying for the betrayal. I was the silent, compliant sponsor of my own cuckolding. The question of why I continued to do this was one I asked myself 1,000 times a day in the long, empty hours of the drive.
The answer was always the same. Liam and Chloe. I was protecting their world. But as time went on, another, more uncomfortable answer began to emerge. Was I protecting them, or was I protecting myself? Was I avoiding a confrontation not because I was noble, but because I was a coward? Was I so terrified of the wreckage that a divorce would cause, so terrified of the unknown landscape of a life without the familiar, if painful, structure of my marriage, that I had chosen this slow, living death as the easier option? The truth was, I was institutionalized. The road, the truck, the sacrifice, it was the only life I knew. I had been the provider for so long that I had forgotten how to be anything else. To stop, to change course, would have required a kind of strength, a kind of courage that I was not sure I possessed. So, I just kept driving. I drove through the seasons. I watched the world change through my windshield. And I felt myself changing too. I was becoming harder, quieter, more distant. The man who had been capable of the grand romantic gesture of driving 2,000 miles to surprise his wife was dead. In his place was this new, hollow man, a man made of diesel and disappointment. The breaking point, the moment the system could no longer sustain the pressure, came not from me, but from him, from Jed. It was a phone call. I was in a blizzard in Montana, my truck chained up, waiting for the highway to reopen. My phone rang. It was an unknown number. I answered. "Is this Reese?" a man's voice asked. It was a voice I had heard only once, in the background of a phone call with my wife, but I recognized it instantly. It was him. "Who's asking?" I said, my own voice a low, dangerous growl. There was a pause. "My name is Jedediah. I think we need to talk." The silence in my cab was absolute, broken only by the howling of the wind outside. The ghost, the man who had been the faceless, nameless engine of my pain, had just spoken my name. He had breached the firewall. He had stepped out of the background of my life and into the foreground. I did not know what he wanted. I did not know what he was about to say. I only knew that the quiet, secret, and carefully managed Cold War I had been waging for 2 years was about to go hot. The road was no longer a big enough place for all of us.
and the storm outside was nothing compared to the one that was about to break. The sound of Jed's voice on the phone was a physical shock, a jolt of high-voltage electricity that arced across the 2,000 miles separating my snowbound truck in Montana from wherever he was. For 2 years, he had been a phantom, a character in a story I was forced to observe from a distance. Now, the phantom had a voice, and he was speaking directly to me. My first instinct was pure white-hot rage. I wanted to curse him, to threaten him, to unload the 2 years of silent, compressed fury I had been carrying. But the machine, the cold, pragmatic trucker who had survived 1,000 near misses on the highway, took over. I said nothing. I just waited. "Are you there?" he asked, his voice hesitant, uncertain. He was not the confident, laughing man from the cafe. He sounded nervous. "I'm here," I said, my voice a flat, dead calm. "You said we need to talk, so talk." I could hear him take a deep, shaky breath. "It's about Bronwyn," he said. Of course it was about Bronwyn. Everything was about Bronwyn. "I know this is going to sound crazy," he continued, the words tumbling out in a rush, "but I think she's in some kind of trouble. She's not herself. She's gone, disappeared. She was supposed to meet me in Denver 3 days ago, and she never showed up. She's not answering her phone. I called her sister. I called her friends. No one has heard from her. I even called the house, and your son said she'd left for a work trip." My blood ran cold. The carefully constructed, if painful, equilibrium of my world had just been shattered. Bronwyn, the master of her secret life, the meticulous planner, had broken her own pattern. This was an anomaly, and in my world, anomalies were always a sign of catastrophic failure. "Why are you calling me?" I asked, my voice still a flat line, betraying none of the sudden, sickening fear that was churning in my gut. "Because I'm scared," he said, and his voice was raw, stripped of all pretense. "Because I think something bad has happened, and because she loved you, man. I know that sounds insane, but she did. She was just lost, and you were the only one who ever really knew her. I thought maybe she would have called you, said something. She loved me." The words were a bitter, ironic joke. But the fear in his voice was real. The man on the other end of the line was not my rival. He was not my enemy. He was just another man, a flawed, foolish man who was in love with the same beautiful and now missing woman. In that moment, we were not two men on opposite sides of a betrayal. We were two men in the same sinking boat. I got the details from him, her last known location, the make and model of her car, her planned route. I hung up the phone. The blizzard outside was still raging, but it was nothing compared to the storm in my own mind. My first thought was that this was a trick, a new, more elaborate lie, a way for them to disappear together, leaving me to hold the bag. But the genuine, unscripted terror in his voice had been undeniable. This was real. I spent the next hour in a state of cold, focused fury. I became the man I had not been for 2 years. I was no longer a passive observer. I was an active agent. I got on the CB radio. I put out a call to every trucker I knew on the western routes. I gave them her car's description. I called in every favor I had ever earned. The community of the road, the silent, anonymous brotherhood I had been a part of for so long, came alive. For the next 24 hours, 1,000 pairs of eyes became my eyes, scanning every highway, every rest stop, every small town between Ohio and Colorado. The call came the next afternoon.
A driver I knew, a man named Sal, had spotted her car. It was parked at a small, rundown motel off a secondary highway in rural Kansas. The place was a known black hole, a place where people went to disappear. I didn't call the police, This was not their business. This was mine. I told Sal to stay put, to watch the room, and to not let anyone in or out. I got in my truck, and I drove. I drove for 18 hours straight, through the tail end of the blizzard, fueled by a cocktail of black coffee, adrenaline, and a terrible cold dread. I was no longer a ghost. I was a hunter. When I pulled into the motel parking lot, the place was just as Sal had described it, a sad, forgotten collection of peeling paint and broken neon. Sal was parked across the street in his rig. He gave me a single grim nod. I walked to the door of her room. I did not knock. I used the spare key I still had for her car to get her room key from the sleepy, indifferent clerk at the front desk. I opened the door. The room was dark, the curtains drawn. It smelled of cheap whiskey and despair. And she was there, sitting on the edge of the bed, a small, huddled figure in the gloom. She was not with another man. She was alone. Utterly, completely alone. She looked up as I entered, her eyes wide and haunted. She was thinner than I had ever seen her, her beautiful, vibrant face now a pale, hollow mask. "Reese," she whispered, her voice a dry, broken thing. "What are you doing here?" "Jed called me," I said, my voice flat, without accusation. "He was worried." She laughed, a short, bitter, humorless sound. "Of course he was," she said. "The asset went missing. The investment stopped paying out." And then the story came out, not in a rush, but in a slow, painful, halting confession. Jed had been in trouble. He had gambling debts, a lot of them, to some very dangerous people. The second, freight forwarding business had not been a partnership. It had been her, trying to earn extra cash to cover his losses, to keep his world from collapsing. But it wasn't enough. He had needed more. And so he had asked her to do something. He had asked her to convince me to invest my retirement savings into a guaranteed transportation stock, a stock that he knew was a complete fraud, a pump-and-dump scheme that would have wiped me out completely. And that had been the one line she could not cross, the one betrayal that was, even for her, too much. "I couldn't do it, Reese," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I couldn't destroy you. You who had been nothing but good to me, who had worked your entire life for us. I couldn't be that person." So she had run. She had run from him, from me, from the entire tangled, impossible mess of the life she had created. She had run to this anonymous, dead-end room to drink herself into a state of quiet, lonely oblivion. I stood there in that sad, dark room, and I listened. And the last, hard, frozen remnants of the anger and hatred in my heart, finally, after all this time, began to melt. I was not looking at a monster. I was not looking at a villain. I was looking at a woman who had made a series of terrible, heartbreaking mistakes, a woman who was just as trapped, just as lost as I had been. I sat down on the bed next to her. I did not touch her. We just sat there in the silence for a long time. Two broken people in a broken room. "What happens now?" she finally whispered. I thought about the road. I thought about my truck. I thought about the long, lonely years ahead. And I thought about the picture on my dashboard, the one of a family that had been real once, a long time ago. "I don't know," I said. And it was the first completely honest thing I had said to her in years. I stayed with her for a week in that motel. We talked. We talked more than we had in the last decade. We didn't talk about forgiveness. It was too soon for that. We just talked. About the choices we had made, about the people we had become. On the 7th day, I made her a proposal. I told her I would not, could not, be her husband anymore. That man was gone forever. But I could be her partner. I could be her co-pilot. I told her about the money I still had, my half. I told her we could buy our own truck, a real one, and both our names. We could start our own legitimate business. We could be a team, a real team, this time, built not on a lie,
but on the hard, brutal, and shared truth of our own wreckage. She looked at me, her eyes full of a hesitant, fragile hope I had not seen in a very long time. "Why?" she asked. "After everything?" "Because," I said, and the words felt true and right and solid in my mouth. "Everyone deserves a second chance at a clean run, even us. Our life now is the road. We are a team, she and I. It is not a life of romance. It is not the life I dreamed of all those years ago. But it is a real life. It is an honest life. We are two people who got lost, who took 1,000 wrong turns, and who are now, finally, after all this time, trying to find our way home, together, 1 mile at a time." Thank you for tuning in to Reddit Whispers. We've all faced moments when everything felt broken. What was your turning point? Leave it in the comments, because your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear right now.